Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Even though it doesn't really make any sense because this is the first time I'm intentionally recording my voice, this is actually a video project for school. Because see, what happened is that I made the unfortunate and arguably foolish decision of taking AP United States History this year. Our final for the class is this here video. Its purpose is to cover a certain aspect of history we didn't learn about, or at least didn't learn about in depth. A bit of a disclaimer before we start. I'm not a historian, and as a consequence, there may be things in this video which I'll mince factually or otherwise just get plain wrong. But I've done a job of compiling information where it might lie, for what it's worth. And so, without any more preamble, let us begin. Now the main idea here in this section, really, is that the economic growth of the United States during the mid-20th century happened primarily as a result of war. The 1930s, by no means a stranger to economic ruin, was sort of hampered, in a sense, first by the traditional Republican model of high tariffs, tax cuts, and overall belief in laissez-faire policy, and then by the progressive New Deal initiatives of FDR. And although Roosevelt's programs did much to stir hope in an otherwise hopeless economic climate, objectively they did little to end the Great Depression. Until the war hit, Roosevelt had wavered between Wilsonian isolationism and aid to the British for some time, while the American public leaned aggressively to the former. But after Pearl Harbor, most Americans were ready to serve justice. And here, really, is when we see the economy begin to heal. And not only heal, but it would become apparent that World War II, for all its history-changing effects, would mark the start of a new and changed American economy. Both the mass mobilization of almost all sectors of the United States, as well as increased government spending during this time, pulled the US out of the Depression. I mean, in 1929, government spending was around 1%. By 1955, it was 17%. Now, that may not seem like much, but in the context of economy, it's a huge boost. And the mass mobilization of America led to what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, a vast bureaucratic network of corporation and government working hand in hand. Here's more or less how it worked. The government would pay private corporations to work on defense systems and essentially any tools that would help them blow the other side up. This included fields such as scientific research and technology. Eventually, companies like Boeing and General Dynamics would become so intertwined, so caught up in the system that, in a very behavioral way, they sort of became surrogate divisions of the Pentagon and Defense Department. Mobilization and government spending for war would continue through the Korean War and Cold War, albeit not as overwhelming as during World War II. But in the big picture, such mobilization was only the beginning. Because while the war healed a damaged economy, the post-war years put it on steroids, and, by extension, changed American society. One of the major causes of both economic and societal change was population growth. After the war, when women returned home from factories and men from the battlefield, they shifted their focus to starting and raising families. This became known, quite notoriously, as the baby boom. Nowadays, baby boomers like to post minion memes on Facebook, but back then they became, in many ways, the spark that would ignite the country's post-war growth. The population boom led to an expansion of consumer markets, for example. As babies came popping out, their mothers required all the necessary things to raise a baby. This led to new products and amenities, of course. But it also led to the construction of shopping malls and supermarkets, which would itself become an industry. You also begin to see the expansion of American suburbs, or as I like to call it, the suburbia Americana. Sort of like the Pax Romana, but with more lawn mowing and less gladiator fights. During this time, the suburban population grew 47%. The most famous of the suburban developments, and one of the first, is probably Levittown, created by this guy, William Levitt. The first homes were built in New York in 1947 for returning veterans. These veterans would often strike deals with organizations like the Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration. Of course, all the daddies and moms and their babies needed a way to get from their new homes to the new malls and supermarkets, and so the 1950s also marked the preponderance of American highway construction. It would be during this time that so many of the highways used today would be built. And as often is the case, the highway boom led to a growth in the automobile industry as well. And it would even lead to new opportunities for business. I mean, McDonald's came around during this time. In addition to adults, you begin to see industries and markets cater to a group I belong to, teenagers. You observe during this time both the economic and, in a way, the philosophical development of quote-unquote youth culture. Nowadays, youth culture is largely just memes and, TikTok. Youth culture itself had sort of started in the 1920s, but it wasn't until the 50s that teenagers presented a very large, untapped, and, perhaps most importantly, a very lucrative demographic. So you see people like Sam Phillips stealing traditionally black musical styles and making Elvis a star, effectively creating rock and roll. And you see the success of movies like Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean, which often celebrated adventurism and rebellion. Parents grew frightened by a perceived decay in moral values, but this sort of thing, of course, always happens. Government assistance also helped the economy, albeit in a more subtle, indirect way. This often came in the form of assistance to veterans. For example, the GI Bill gave veterans mortgage assistance, which enabled them to buy homes in the newly formed suburbia, and help in accessing educational opportunities and technical and/or vocational training. You have the passing of the National Defense Education Act, which increased funding for schools. It also helped with the massive corporate growth during this time, and when I say massive growth, I mean like 3 companies owning 90% of an industry and stuff like that, required a huge white-collar army. Jobs became easier to find. The phenomenon of the organization man developed, someone who essentially sold their individuality to the corporation that employed them. In a way, this recalls the plight of labor workers during the Gilded Age under scientific management. Nevertheless, an education, combined with corporate needs, led to a one-way ticket into the middle class, for white people at least. All of these factors, from war to highways, changed America in deeply new ways. As Alan Brinkley at the Gilder Lehrman Institute put it so succinctly, the cumulative economic effect of all these changes was a radical change in the American life, the birth of an economy, and thus a society in which many Americans came to consider affluence a norm, in which the ability not just to subsist, but greatly to enhance the quality of one's life came to seem a basic right, in which material abundance became one of the ways in which many, probably most, Americans defined their world. While the 1950s themselves are a grand display of American affluence and brimming opportunity, at least for white Americans, they also represented, in context of the greater American story, the makings of both reform and revolution. The 1960s, of course, was the era of change, of civil rights and counterculture. But it is during the 50s that the seeds for this change would be sown. During the 1950s and the 1940s, African Americans would obtain the necessary opportunities and tools to start their fight for rights. The mass mobilization we talked about earlier necessitated an army of workers, and, because a large percentage of men were on the battlefield, the slack would have to be taken up by others. This included women and black Americans. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of other minorities. Japanese Americans living in Southern California, most famously, were locked up in internment camps far from home. However, the mobilization of both women and black Americans would have large ramifications for the future, because it would enable these groups to seek after the expansion of their rights. Black Americans, in a way, were the first to step up. In June of 1941, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which prohibited racial discrimination in defense industries. This would be accompanied by the continuation of the Great Migration, which, although started in World War I, nevertheless gave black Americans new opportunities in work. Early civil rights movements, such as the Double V campaign, would set precedents for later advocacy of legal and political action. Work, however, would not be the only sector opened up to African Americans. During the 1950s, they would gain the economic leverage needed to build a voice for social change. This often came with the Veterans Benefits programs, which gave black Americans the opportunity to obtain education. With enough time, the black middle class grew to include more people as a result of this process. And being in the middle class, such Americans would have the means necessary for carving out a voice in the greater national conscience. The expansion of education would also lead black Americans to become more involved in professional fields. Many would find jobs as ministers, teachers, doctors, attorneys, and more. You can see the shift in Brown versus Board of Education, which was advocated for by Thurgood Marshall and other black attorneys. Although he attended college in the 30s and 40s, the success of the Supreme Court case bore witness to growing leverage among black Americans. He later would become an associate justice on the Supreme Court. The 1950s, however, was not marked exclusively with growing opportunity for the black community. Instead, their growth caused a paradoxical mix of both blessing and curse. Because while a voice was developing, and people of color were given more opportunity, ugly developments in the cities increased discrimination. Here's sort of what happened. Because of the aforementioned suburbia Americana, many white urbanites moved out of the city to settle in these new homes. More often than not, these suburbs barred blacks from buying in them. Levittown, for example, was meant only for, quote, the Caucasian race, and suburbs became increasingly homogenous, racially speaking. As a result, black Americans, especially those of poor economic standing, would be left behind in the cities. Those white Americans who lived in the cities often segregated themselves into nicer areas, as well, and were thus shielded from the ghettos. This sort of white escape is sometimes known as the white flight, and it compounded already existing disparities and problems of racial discrimination. This paradox is, I think, most acutely captured in a photo from the 1968 Olympics, which were hosted in Mexico. It's a famous photo, and not really in the time frame that we're looking at. But in my estimation, it gives a good view of the paradox of the 50s and 60s. Here it is. The two sprinters in the picture, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, are giving the Black Power salute, which grew out of the post-60s civil rights movements. Think Black Panther Party and Black nationalism. And sort of the idea here is that Smith and Carlos are using their advantage of being in the Olympics as an opportunity to speak for those who do not have a voice, mainly the poor. As one Time article noted, Smith in black socks, his running shoes off, is a gesture meant to symbolize black poverty. It goes on to describe other symbols, how Carlos's unzipped jacket represents solidarity with blue-collar workers, his necklace the lynchings and killings of African Americans. Poverty was not only an issue among black Americans, however. In general, the massive opulence of the 1950s was accompanied by a more unattractive reality, the fact that the majority of those in poverty remained poor. They were not able to share in the economic success with the rest of the country. As our friend Alan Brinkley puts it, distribution patterns remained unchanged. The wealthy and the poor experienced roughly the same rates of growth. The gap between them remained the same. Such realities were under the radar of most Americans until economist John Kenneth Galbraith published his book, The Affluent Society. In it, he exposes the stagnant gap and calls the poor, quote, an afterthought in the middle-class mind. Social critic Michael Harrington joined in on the fun a couple years later with The Other America, talking of the economic underworld of the United States. Such developments can be seen as a precursor, and in many ways a cause, of LBJ's Great Society initiatives. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower coined the term military-industrial complex during his farewell address, in an effort to warn against its dangers. In a speech he gave in 1953, he also did similar. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. So although the 50s saw great economic growth, some were keen enough to realize that those from disadvantaged backgrounds were not able to share in it, and this realization would be addressed in the 60s and beyond. In addition to African Americans and the poor, women also faced challenges, though their challenges were perhaps not as apparent as those of the former. A prevailing ideal during the 1950s was the middle-class domestic ideal, the triumph of the nuclear family, which can be summed up perfectly in images like this. And for women, their allotted position was simply mother, wife, and housekeeper. Femininity meant staying at home and cooking dinner. Media enforced this too. Think of sitcoms like I Love Lucy, in which Lucy repeatedly tries, and fails, to break out of her place at home. The implications are clear. The domestic ideal became a powerful force in shaping views on women and gender roles, and it's even reminiscent of older American ideals, those of the 19th century and, even, in some respects, the Republican motherhood of post-revolution America. However, all of this is in contrast to the very real actualities of working women. As my AP book pointed out, women were often caught between the gravity of two forces, one of which was the aforementioned domestic ideal, and the other, the job market. Because the truth is, the job market grew for women as well, and many women took advantage of such opportunities. Just for a statistical view, in 1954, half of all married women worked. A good percentage of this was, of course, working-class women who worked to help the family, but it was those in the middle class, who could afford a college education, who faced a bit more trouble. For starters, middle-class women were often barred from many jobs on the basis of gender. Many sectors were predominantly male, with little room for advancement. Women were often given gender jobs, things like nursing or teaching or secretarying. I don't know. You can see it in these ads from that time. And secondly, culturally driven media discouraged women from working. There's I Love Lucy, which we mentioned, but there were more surly implications elsewhere. For example, psychologists often claimed that domestic mothers were the normal type, and those who wanted to work were misfits and needed therapy. Such media reinforced the domestic ideal. Despite such rhetoric, however, women still took to the workforce in large and ever-increasing numbers. Gender discrimination, cultural ideals, and increasing numbers of women in the workforce would, eventually, lead to the women's liberation movement and the second-wave feminism of the 1970s. Perhaps inspired by the civil rights movements of the 1960s, women would begin to advocate for greater equality in areas like employment, as well as change cultural ideas about women. It was during this time that Roe v. Wade happened, which made abortion a constitutional right. The beginning of this movement is often seen as Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963. The book is a direct response to the domestic ideal of the 1950s. Friedan argues that women were trapped, in a sense, as housewives and mothers, and were unhappy as a result. So as you can see, the 1950s set the foundation for the later women's movements of the 1960s and 70s. And not only women's movements, but also those of social reform and racial reform. So, what does all this mean? Well, the 1950s is sort of when the classic image of American was born. I'm talking about grandma's apple pie, baseball, walking to school in the snow, white Republican Protestant Christians, the suburbia Americana, the nuclear family, the fulfillment of the American dream, the Joneses, rollerblading waitresses, the white picket fence, every Norman Rockwell painting ever. But as we've seen, this is only a mythological ideal. Because while it's true that America saw great growth after World War II, hiding underneath that bright surface lurked racism and poverty, and realities that often broke the mythology of the middle class. And it was ultimately during the 1950s that, in a very important way, foundations for later movements, great movements of change and struggle and revolution, would develop. The 1950s reminds us that, in our own time, although we may hear stories that confirm a certain status quo, whether it be one of success or doom, ultimately there will always be deeper forces at play, forces that, hopefully, lay the foundation for even better tomorrows. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Lord knows I didn't. Like I said at the start, be wary that there may be inconsistencies and subtle or small errors here or there. This period is vast, like all of history, and I couldn't possibly hope to do it justice in a short video like this. If you want to learn more about some of the topics discussed here, I recommend checking out the videos my other classmates made. Over on M the Small Child's channel, you can hear her talk about some of the minorities I didn't cover in this video, Mexican Americans, and the LGBT community, and each group's struggle for rights in the 60s and 70s. On Aminovas, you can learn all about the Cold War stuff of this time period, JFK, and that one time we almost blew each other up. And if you want to learn about the Black Panther Party and Black nationalism, head on over to Eddie's video. They were actually pretty hardcore. As lastly, I just want to give a big shout out to my brother Tristan. You can visit him over at Babish Prophet, link in both the description and in the cards. He really helped me with this video, especially the audio. Right, Tristan?
Wait, give me a second. Yeah, I did.
Of course, if you feel like subscribing to me, or any of the aforementioned lovely persons, go right ahead. And with that, I end the video here.